Hey guys, tonight we step into a corridor that smells faintly of wax, old fabric, and the kind of silence that presses against your ears, where black velvet drapes swallow candlelight, and every footstep feels like an intrusion. You're standing inside a royal palace at dusk, watching servants smooth mourning cloth over mirrors, windows, even paintings, as if grief itself might escape and embarrass someone important. This is not the soft, private sadness you recognize. This is grief, choreographed, rehearsed, and enforced. And yes, fair warning, you probably won't survive this story with your cozy illusions about royal sorrow intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments, because it's always slightly magical knowing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin to notice almost immediately that royal mourning has very little to do with how someone actually feels. The black cloth, the veils, the armbands, the sealed rooms, none of it starts as an emotional response. It starts as a signal. Long before tabloids and press secretaries, this was how power spoke without words. When a monarch died, the palace didn't just grieve, it broadcasted. Black flags went up not because hearts were broken, but because authority needed to look uninterrupted, solemn, and legitimate. Grief in this world was a uniform. One mainstream historical fact grounds you here. By the late medieval period in Europe, royal mourning protocols were codified with astonishing precision. Courts across France, Spain, England, and the Holy Roman Empire issued formal regulations dictating how long mourning would last, what colours could be worn, which fabrics were acceptable, and who was required to participate. This wasn't optional. Wearing the wrong shade of grey instead of sanctioned black could cost you favour, income, or safety. Mourning was law. As you walk deeper into this system, you realise the colour black itself wasn't always the default. Earlier, royal courts favoured white as the colour of mourning, white for purity, for the soul released from earthly corruption. French queens famously wore tuile blanc, white mourning, well into the 16th century. The shift to black came gradually, tied to expense, symbolism, and control. Black dye was costly and difficult to produce consistently, which meant it immediately separated elites from everyone else. Grief, like everything royal, had to be exclusive. There's a quirky tidbit historians love to whisper about here. In some courts, mirrors were covered not to prevent vanity, but because it was believed that spirits could become trapped in reflections during mourning periods. Imagine that. Grief so heavy it risks imprisoning ghosts. Whether superstition or convenient excuse to erase individuality, the result was the same, a palace stripped of self-recognition. You weren't meant to see yourself. You were meant to disappear into the performance. And this is where the white lies begin. Publicly, mourning was framed as devotion, proof that a ruler was loved, that a dynasty was united in loss. Privately, it was a tool to freeze time. Mourning suspended celebrations, halted political challenges, delayed marriages, and conveniently silenced dissent. You don't argue with a throne draped in black. You wait, you lower your voice, you accept continuity. Historians still argue whether early royal mourning rituals emerged more from genuine religious belief or from pragmatic governance, but the evidence suggests an uncomfortable blend of both. Christianity encouraged visible sorrow as a form of humility, while monarchies recognized that visible sorrow discouraged rebellion. A grieving ruler looked human, a grieving court looked stable. Everyone played along. You start to sense how exhausting this must have been. Mourning wasn't just emotional restraint, it was physical. Heavy wool garments layered in summer heat. veils restricting vision, jewelry removed, color erased. Some courts even restricted bathing and grooming under the belief that pleasure of any kind disrespected the dead. Grief, apparently, should itch. And yet, beneath all that sombre fabric, ambition kept breathing. The same nobles bowing their heads were counting days, watching carefully for cracks. Mourning periods were known opportunities for quiet maneuvering, because rules were temporarily rigid and predictable. If you knew when mourning would officially end, you knew exactly when the next marriage, alliance, or power grab could begin. Grief became a countdown clock. There's a modern aside that's hard to ignore here. If this all sounds a bit like social media performative sadness, profile pictures turning grayscale on cue, you're not imagining the parallel. Royal mourning trained entire populations to read emotion as messaging. Sorrow had to be visible, synchronized, and correctly branded. Authenticity was irrelevant. Compliance was everything. And yes, if you wore black too enthusiastically, people noticed that too. Nothing suspicious like enjoying grief a bit too much. You pause in one long gallery, imagining the courtiers practicing solemn expressions in the reflective sheen of polished floors, since mirrors were off-limits. It's almost funny in a bleak way. Joke number one gently slipped in. Imagine being punished not for smiling, but for smiling incorrectly. Court life was basically an early access version of emotional surveillance. Another mainstream fact anchors the scene. In Tudor England, royal proclamations explicitly stated that mourning attire signalled loyalty to the crown itself, not merely respect for the deceased. That distinction matters. You weren't mourning a person, you were mourning an institution. Failed to participate and you weren't heartless, you were treasonous. This explains why mourning cloth draped entire cities, not just palaces. Churches, marketplaces, even ships in port displayed black banners. The message reached illiterate populations instantly. Something has happened. Authority remains. Do not test it. The dead king may be gone, but the system that ruled you yesterday is very much alive. There's a fringe theory, still debated, that prolonged royal mourning also served as a psychological reset for populations traumatized by succession violence. Historians still argue whether extended grief rituals genuinely soothed societies or simply delayed inevitable unrest, but the timing is suspiciously convenient. While people focused on ritual, power consolidated quietly elsewhere. You begin to understand that mourning wasn't about closure. It was about containment, containing emotion, containing ambition, containing memory. Even the dead had to behave. Certain deaths were emphasized with lavish mourning, while others were minimized, rushed, or quietly ignored. Black cloth could be generous or stingy. And this is where the darkness sharpens. Because if grief was mandated, then joy became dangerous. Laughter during mourning periods wasn't just rude, it was suspect. Who laughs when the king is dead? Someone with plans, perhaps. Someone not sufficiently afraid. The court learned to fear happiness more than sadness, which is honestly a mood most of us recognize at 2 a.m. As you drift toward the end of this first stretch, you realize you're not just watching history. You're feeling the weight of a system that trained people to perform loss for survival. Real grief, messy and unpredictable, had no place here. It was replaced by choreography. Black cloth, white lies, and somewhere beneath all that fabric, the human heart kept beating, waiting for permission it rarely received. You move forward without ceremony because ceremony is exactly the thing you're starting to distrust. The black cloth is still there, heavier now, but you notice something else creeping in alongside it. Rules about who is allowed to feel anything at all. Mourning, it turns out, is not evenly distributed. It never was. As you drift through an antechamber crowded with bowed heads, you realize grief here is ranked, measured, and rationed like bread in a siege. At the top, of course, stands the immediate royal family. Their mourning is mandatory, elaborate, and relentlessly visible. Beneath them, layers unfold: extended kin, nobles, court officials, servants, and finally, the public, whose grief is expected but rarely acknowledged. You begin to see that royal mourning isn't a shared experience, it's a hierarchy of permission. Some tiers are honoured, others are inconvenient. A solid, mainstream historical fact anchors this realization. In many European courts from the late Middle Ages through the early modern period, mourning regulations explicitly listed who was required to mourn and for how long, based on proximity to the throne. Queens and princes might be bound to months or years of formal grief, while lesser nobles were granted weeks and servants sometimes only days. The closer you were to power, the longer you were expected to suffer publicly. Grief was a tax on relevance. But here's the twist that makes you pause. Some people were forbidden to mourn at all. Political enemies, disgraced relatives, mistresses, illegitimate children, entire categories of humans were expected to pretend nothing had happened. A death could occur inches from their lives, and still they were required to move on instantly, faces neutral, clothing unchanged. Silence was their loyalty test. There's a quirky, unsettling tidbit tucked into court records. In certain royal households, servants were instructed to maintain normal cheerfulness during mourning periods, precisely because their visible sadness might blur social boundaries. Imagine that. Grief considered too equalizing. If everyone mourned the same way, hierarchy might wobble. Better to keep sorrow stratified. You start to feel how emotionally violent that must have been. Grief is already isolating. Now imagine being told that your sadness is inappropriate because of your rank. You're allowed to clean the mourning chamber, but not to mourn inside it. You're close enough to loss to smell the wax and damp wool, but too low to acknowledge why. Historians still argue whether these restrictions were primarily about maintaining decorum or about preventing emotional solidarity across classes, but the effect is hard to ignore. Mourning could bond people, bonded people could talk, talking people could notice injustices. So grief was carefully fenced. Gender sharpens the divide even further. Women were often expected to mourn more intensely and for longer periods than men of equivalent rank, but paradoxically, their grief was taken less seriously. A weeping woman was natural, a grieving man was noble. That double standard let male rulers opt out of emotional display while forcing women into it, like living memorials. You see this clearly in royal courts, where kings resumed hunting councils and even mistresses within weeks of a queen's death, while widowed queens vanished behind veils for years. No one called the king heartless, everyone praised his strength. Joke number 1 drifts in gently. Apparently, emotional availability was already considered suspicious behavior for men centuries ago. Then there's the children. Royal children were often required to participate in mourning rituals long before they could understand death. Tiny black outfits, miniature veils, solemn processions rehearsed like theatre. Yet their grief didn't count as grief, it counted as symbolism. They were props for continuity, proof that the line endured. Crying was permitted only if it photographed well in memory. Another mainstream fact grounds this discomfort. In Bourbon, France, mourning etiquette extended even to infants, with royal nurseries instructed to maintain subdued tones and dark fabrics after a death. Childhood, like grief, was not private property. And still, not all grief was suppressed. Some was exaggerated. Courtiers competed to display sorrow more convincingly than their rivals. Too little grief suggested disloyalty. Too much suggested ambition. The sweet spot was narrow, and missing it could ruin you. Emotional moderation became a survival skill. There's a fringe anecdote whispered through memoirs. Some nobles allegedly practiced mourning rehearsals, timing their sighs and expressions before entering public spaces. Historians still argue whether these accounts reflect widespread behavior or isolated paranoia. But honestly, after everything you've seen, it's not that hard to believe. This was a world where facial control was a political asset. You start to notice how mourning also functioned as exclusion. Those barred from official grief were erased from the narrative of loss itself. If you weren't allowed to mourn publicly, history often pretended you didn't love, depend on, or even know the deceased. Silence rewrote relationships. And this is where the system reveals its coldest edge. Mourning wasn't about honoring bonds, it was about reinforcing which bonds mattered. Grief validated status. Denial of grief erased it. The dead were less important than the living hierarchy rearranging itself around them. As you drift onward, you feel a strange familiarity. You've seen versions of this before, whose pain gets airtime, whose loss becomes a headline, whose grief is considered excessive or suspicious. Royal courts didn't invent emotional inequality, they just perfected it with velvet and law. You pass a doorway where laughter is quietly returning for those allowed to move on, while others remain frozen in sanctioned sorrow. Mourning clocks tick at different speeds depending on who you are. And you understand now, in this world, grief is not a feeling, it's a privilege. You don't need to be told where this is going. You can already feel the air grow heavier as you step into spaces designed not just for mourning, but for permanence. This is where grief stops being a phase and hardens into a lifestyle. Widowhood at court is not a season, it's a sentence. And you're about to watch how queens, in particular, were wrapped in black so tightly that time itself seemed to stop for them. You enter chambers where sunlight is filtered through layers of dark fabric, where furniture is simplified, colors drained, and movement slowed. These rooms are not temporary, they are meant to last. When a king dies, the widow does not simply mourn him, she becomes his memorial. Her body, her clothing, her schedule, even her social world are reorganized around absence. The crown moves on, she does not. Here's a clear mainstream historical fact. In many European monarchies, royal widows were expected to observe lifelong or near lifelong mourning, especially if they did not remarry. Spain is the most infamous example. Spanish queens and queen mothers often wore black for decades, sometimes until their deaths. Following a court culture so rigid it became known as the court of perpetual mourning. This wasn't custom, it was policy. You start to understand why the phrase velvet prison fits so well. These women were not locked away in towers, they were entombed in etiquette. They retained titles, incomes and residences but lost visibility, influence and often relevance. A queen in mourning was meant to fade quietly like a candle, burning low in a chapel no one visited anymore. There's a quirky, haunting tidbit historians love to mention. Some widowed queens were required to give away or destroy brightly coloured dresses they owned before marriage. Not store them, not alter them, eliminate them. Colour itself was treated as a betrayal of memory. Imagine erasing your past wardrobe because it implied you once had joy. And yet these women were still watched constantly. A widow's behaviour was scrutinised more intensely than a reigning queen's. Too much seclusion suggested plotting. Too much visibility suggested vanity. The acceptable middle ground was narrow and exhausting. Even grief had optics. Historians still argue whether perpetual mourning was intended primarily as a safeguard against remarriage alliances or as a symbolic reinforcement of dynastic loyalty, but the result was the same either way. A widowed queen's sexuality, ambition and future were neutralized in one move. She became politically safe by becoming socially inert. You begin to see the gendered hypocrisy glaringly. Kings who lost queens often remarried within months, for strategic reasons. Widowed queens who remarried, even years later, were viewed with suspicion, sometimes outright hostility. Grief was supposed to define them permanently. Joke number 1 drifts in softly. Apparently, "till death do us part" applied only if you were female and inconvenient. Some widows tried to push back in subtle ways. Jewelry became coded, a slightly lighter shade of black, a fabric with hidden sheen. These were small rebellions, but rebellions nonetheless. Court watchers noticed everything. A silk weave that caught too much light could spark gossip about emotional impropriety. Yes, really. This is where fashion criticism first learned to ruin lives. A mainstream fact grounds this tension. Queen Victoria's prolonged mourning after Prince Albert's death in 1861 set a modern benchmark, but it echoed much older traditions. She wore black for 40 years, withdrew from public life, and reshaped British mourning culture in her image. What looks like devotion also functioned as political insulation. Her grief made criticism feel cruel. But not all widows chose silence willingly. Some were actively pressured into seclusion by councils eager to control succession narratives. A visible, charismatic widow could become a rallying point. Better to dim her light before others gathered around it. There's a fringe anecdote, debated but persistent, that certain courts encouraged widows to adopt intense religious routines, not purely for piety, but because prayer schedules conveniently kept them occupied and isolated. Historians still argue whether this was strategic manipulation or sincere devotion, but the overlap is suspiciously tidy. Nothing occupies a woman quite like holiness. You feel the loneliness of these spaces. Mourning rooms weren't just dark, they were quiet. Social visits were restricted, celebrations were off-limits, even music was often prohibited. Silence became both companion and jailer, and in that silence, identity eroded. Who are you when you are no longer wife, ruler, or romantic possibility? Only a reminder? And yet power sometimes lingered in unexpected ways. Queen mothers in mourning could still influence through proximity to heirs. Advice whispered in shadowed rooms mattered. Grief did not always erase authority, sometimes it cloaked it. Remember that. It will matter later. As you move on, you realize something chilling. Lifelong mourning didn't honor love. It preserved control. It ensured that certain women never fully re-entered the political game, never disrupted new alliances, never reminded the court that loyalty could be personal rather than institutional. The black fabric wasn't just for memory, it was for containment. You leave these rooms understanding that for royal widows, grief was not a process to heal from. It was an identity assigned, enforced, and rarely forgiven. You don't step out of mourning here, you watch it turn sharp. The softness you might expect from grief hardens into something deliberate, almost strategic. This is where sorrow stops being passive and starts speaking in coded threats. You can feel it in the way black banners hang not just low, but wide as if daring neighboring courts to comment. Mourning, you realize, is no longer about who died, it's about who's watching. Royal courts learned early that grief could travel faster than armies. A court that mourned loudly sent a message: we are unified, we are wronged, and we remember. The silence between bells was filled with implication. You didn't need a declaration of war when mourning said everything for you. A mainstream historical fact anchors this shift. In early modern Europe, extended royal mourning was often synchronized with diplomatic signaling. Lengthening or shortening official mourning periods after a monarch's death could imply approval, disdain, or outright hostility toward foreign courts. When France mourned Spain's monarch briefly or not at all, it was noticed deeply. Grief had a foreign policy. You picture ambassadors standing in dark halls, counting days. Did the court remove black too soon? Did they keep it longer than expected? Every choice was read like a coded letter. Mourning became a language fluent only to the powerful and dangerously misinterpreted by the careless. Here's a quirky but revealing tidbit. Some courts intentionally delayed announcing a monarch's death, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while quietly preparing mourning displays elsewhere. When the announcement finally came, the sudden, overwhelming show of grief felt theatrical, almost aggressive. Surprise sorrow, it turns out, can be a flex. Historians still argue whether this manipulation of mourning was universally understood by contemporaries or only by elite insiders, but diplomatic correspondence suggests leaders absolutely noticed. They commented on it. They reacted to it. Mourning offended people. That alone should tell you it wasn't innocent. You feel how grief becomes a shield here. A court in mourning could justify cancelled visits, delayed negotiations, and ignored demands. We are not in a position to discuss this, they would say, draped in black. And no one could push without appearing monstrous. Grief granted immunity. Sometimes mourning became a provocation. A court might exaggerate sorrow after a suspicious death, daring rivals to deny responsibility. Silence could be interpreted as guilt. Excessive grief suggested accusation. This was emotional brinkmanship centuries before the term existed. Joke number 1 slides in quietly. Think of it as the original subtweet, just with velvet, bells, and plausible deniability. You notice how rulers carefully curated their own appearances during these periods. A king appearing publicly in deep mourning signalled continuity and resolve. A queen appearing veiled and distant suggested vulnerability and invited sympathy. Both were tools. Both were chosen. A solid historical example supports this. After the death of Charles the Bold in 1477, the Burgundian court's mourning rituals were closely observed by both French and Habsburg envoys, who interpreted every detail as evidence of political intent. Grief didn't just follow power struggles, it participated in them. And then there's vengeance. Mourning could imply unfinished business. Courts sometimes maintained black long after religious custom required, signalling that a death remained unresolved. The message was simple. We remember, and memory can be dangerous. There's a fringe theory, still debated, that some prolonged mourning rituals were deliberately designed to keep military forces mobilized without openly declaring war. Soldiers in black livery, flags lowered but weapons ready. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic coincidence or quiet preparation, but the overlap is hard to ignore. You sense how exhausting this must have been. Grief was no longer personal, it was performative pressure. Every tear was measured, every sigh interpreted. Even genuine sadness had to pass through political calculation. Feel too much and you look unstable, feel too little and you look complicit. And yet the public rarely questioned it. People expected rulers to mourn visibly. It reassured them that order persisted. A grieving court looked serious, responsible, safe. The alternative, leaders acting normally after death, felt unsettling, even immoral. This is where mourning becomes one of the most elegant tools power ever invented. It demanded obedience without force. It delayed conflict while escalating tension. It communicated intent without committing action, all wrapped in the moral armor of grief. As you move onward, you carry this understanding with you. Royal mourning didn't just reflect politics, it was politics, spoken softly, dressed darkly, and understood by everyone who mattered. You notice the shift before anyone explains it. The corridors grow quieter, but smaller, lower to the ground, as if the architecture itself has decided to stoop. This is where mourning descends into the nursery, where black fabric meets small hands that don't yet understand why their world has dimmed. Children here are not spared grief. They are inducted into it. Royal heirs were introduced to death early and formally. not through whispered explanations or gentle distance, but through ceremony. You imagine a child being dressed in miniature mourning clothes, fabric heavy and unfamiliar, shoes stiff, movement restricted. No one asks how they feel. What matters is how they look. A mainstream historical fact grounds this unease. In many European monarchies, royal children were required to participate in funeral processions and official mourning rites regardless of age. Even toddlers were present at elaborate funerals, positioned deliberately to be seen by the public. The message was clear. The line continues. Loss has not broken us. But here's the part that makes your stomach tighten. These children were often discouraged from expressing spontaneous emotion. Crying too loudly disrupted decorum. Smiling was unacceptable. They were coached, corrected, sometimes punished for emotional missteps. Mourning wasn't meant to be felt. It was meant to be displayed correctly. There's a quietly disturbing tidbit tucked into court manuals. Some royal nurseries were redecorated entirely during mourning periods, replacing bright toys and fabrics with muted tones, even black ribbons tied around cradles. Imagine learning about death before you learn your colors. Historians still argue whether this was believed to ease children into solemnity or simply reflected adult discomfort with joy during grief, but the impact on childhood is undeniable. You begin to sense how this shaped rulers long before they wore crowns. A child raised in ritualized grief learns early that emotion is something you manage, not something you explore. Loss becomes procedural. Love becomes conditional. It's hard to grieve freely when you've been trained to perform sadness since infancy. This training served a purpose. Children who might one day rule had to appear composed in crisis. A public breakdown during mourning could be interpreted as weakness, instability, or worse, divine disfavor. So composure was drilled early, sometimes harshly. Childhood softness was considered a liability. Joke number one drifts in gently because you need it. Royal childhoods were basically emotional boot camp, but with better outfits and far worse therapy. A historical example sharpens the picture. After the death of Louis XIV's heirs, surviving Bourbon children were repeatedly paraded in mourning, becoming living symbols of resilience rather than protected mourners. Their presence reassured the nation. Their feelings were secondary. And yet, not all children reacted the same way. Some became emotionally withdrawn. Others developed intense anxiety around death. A few became fascinated by mortality itself. Court observers sometimes remarked on young princes who spoke of funerals with unsettling familiarity. When death is your earliest public role, it leaves a mark. There's a fringe anecdote, often debated, that certain royal tutors used mourning periods as moral instruction, telling children that joy invited punishment and that sorrow proved virtue. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or exaggerated by later memoirs, but it aligns uncomfortably well with the moral language of the time. You realize how grief also became a bonding mechanism among siblings, but a fragile one. They shared silence more than comfort. Physical affection was limited. Mourning etiquette discouraged play, laughter, even roughhousing. Loss taught restraint, not closeness. And yet, paradoxically, these children were expected to represent hope. Black clothes, solemn faces, tiny hands waving stiffly at crowds, proof that the future existed even while the present mourned. It's a heavy symbolic burden for anyone, let alone someone who still needs help tying their shoes. You move past the nursery, knowing that these early lessons echo loudly later. A ruler who learned grief as performance will govern accordingly. Emotion becomes messaging, vulnerability becomes dangerous, and death, once personal, becomes administrative. The children grow up. The black clothes are replaced, but the training remains. You start to notice something unsettling as the mourning stretches on, not the sadness, but the invoices. Grief, it turns out, is expensive, very expensive. The black cloth that drapes halls and bodies doesn't appear by magic. And as you walk through storerooms stacked with fabric bolts, you realize mourning has quietly become an economic engine. Every death feeds a system. Royal courts required vast quantities of mourning materials: black wool, crepe, silk, dye, ribbons, gloves, hatbands, furniture covers, carriage drapes, horse tack. Even candles were sometimes dyed darker. This wasn't symbolic excess, it was mandated supply. When a monarch died, entire industries stirred awake. A mainstream historical fact anchors this realization. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European courts often issued bulk contracts for mourning supplies immediately after a royal death, sometimes plunging treasuries into short-term debt. Mourning wasn't paused for budgeting, it was the budget. You imagine tailors working through the night, hands stained with black dye that never quite washes out. Mourning clothes were often required to be newly made. Wearing old black garments could be interpreted as disrespectful, or worse, opportunistic. Even grief had to look fresh. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost absurd until you sit with it. Some courts regulated the quality of black fabric according to rank. A duke's mourning black was deeper, richer, more light-absorbing than a lesser noble's. Grief itself came in luxury tiers. Historians still argue whether contemporaries consciously noticed these differences or simply absorbed them instinctively, but the hierarchy was woven directly into the cloth. And who paid for all this? Not just the crown. Nobles were expected to outfit entire households in mourning at their own expense. Servants, horses, carriages, everyone wore black. For lesser families, a single, extended mourning period could be financially devastating. Debt followed death like a shadow. You begin to see how mourning became a quiet form of exploitation. Tailors, dyers, and merchants benefited, yes, but only certain ones. Courts favored approved suppliers, often granting monopolies. Mourning contracts became lucrative political rewards. Grief greased palms. Joke number one slides in dryly. Nothing says, sorry for your loss, like a government-mandated shopping spree. There's a darker layer beneath the commerce. In some regions, widows, especially noble ones, were expected to fund their own mourning wardrobes indefinitely. That meant maintaining an entire black-only wardrobe for years or decades. Lifelong grief wasn't just emotionally draining, it was financially binding. Black silk doesn't come cheap, and it certainly doesn't come with joy. A historical example sharpens this point. In Habsburg territories, court records show repeated petitions from nobles requesting exemptions or extensions on mourning expenses, citing ruinous costs. Grief, they argued, was bankrupting them. The court rarely agreed. Historians still argue whether these financial pressures were intentional tools of control or unintended consequences of rigid tradition, but the outcome was convenient either way. Mourning drained resources, distracted elites, and reinforced dependence on royal favor. Even the poor weren't spared. In cities, guilds and churches sometimes pressured commoners to adopt mourning symbols, black armbands, ribbons, or draped windows during royal deaths. For families already struggling, these expectations meant choosing between food and loyalty. Grief demanded sacrifice. You notice how this system also policed excess. Too little spending on mourning suggested disloyalty. Too much suggested ambition or theatricality. The correct level of expense was known only to insiders and constantly shifting. Emotional expression had a price range. There's a fringe anecdote, often repeated in court gossip, that some nobles secretly reused mourning clothes between deaths, disguising wear to avoid costs. Historians still argue how widespread this was, but even the rumor tells you something important. Grief was unsustainable. As you drift onward, you realize mourning wasn't just a response to death. It was a redistribution event. Wealth moved, debts formed, favour shifted, entire economies pulsed to the rhythm of royal mortality. The dead were honoured, yes, but the living paid. You can almost feel the fabric tightening as you move forward, as if the rules themselves are pulling closer around your ribs. This is where mourning stops being merely expensive or exhausting and becomes actively dangerous. Etiquette in these courts is not gentle guidance. It's a minefield. One misstep, one shade too light, one gesture too relaxed, and your entire standing can collapse. Mourning rules were obsessively detailed. Courts issued lists specifying how long black must be worn, when it could be softened to grey or violet, which accessories were acceptable, and exactly when colour could return. These transitions were not gradual or intuitive. They were scheduled. Miss the schedule, and you risked everything. A mainstream historical fact grounds this tension. In Victorian Britain, influenced by Queen Victoria's own prolonged mourning, etiquette manuals outlined multiple stages of mourning: deep, second, half, each with its own wardrobe requirements. Deviating from these stages wasn't just gauche, it was interpreted as moral failure. Grief had milestones, and you were expected to hit them on time. You begin to realize how psychologically cruel this was. Mourning doesn't move in straight lines, but here it was forced to. Feel better too soon and you were cold. Linger too long and you were unstable. The rules didn't care how you felt. They cared how you appeared. There's a quirky, anxiety-inducing tidbit hidden in correspondence from European courts. Some nobles kept mourning calendars, marking exactly which garments could be worn on which dates. Imagine needing a planner just to grieve correctly. Historians still argue whether this reflected genuine anxiety or simply the complexity of court life, but either way, it's deeply unsettling. And then there were the punishments. They weren't always official. More often, they came as social death. Invitations stopped arriving. Audiences were delayed indefinitely. Whispers spread. Mourning mistakes were framed as character flaws, not fashion errors. Joke number one slips in softly but sharply. Nothing like being emotionally devastated and dress-coded at the same time. You can notice how these rules hit women harder again. A woman's mourning attire was scrutinized more closely. Her body read more aggressively for signs of impropriety. A slightly fitted bodice, a hint of sheen. Suddenly grief was being questioned. Was she enjoying attention? Was she eager to move on? The clothes became a moral test. Men, by contrast, often enjoyed more flexibility. A black armband might suffice, a somber expression, then back to business. The hypocrisy wasn't subtle. Mourning etiquette reinforced gender expectations under the guise of respect. A historical example sharpens the stakes. In 19th century European courts, several women were socially ostracized after being accused, sometimes falsely, of ending mourning too early. Careers stalled, marriages collapsed. All because fabric changed color before gossip approved. There's a fringe theory, still debated, that some mourning rules were intentionally vague, allowing those in power to punish selectively. Historians still argue whether ambiguity was accidental or strategic, but the effect was clear. Fear kept people compliant. You feel how exhausting constant vigilance must have been. Every morning you dress not just your body, but your reputation. Every public appearance is a test. Grief is no longer internal, it's a performance review. And the cruelty deepens when you realize there was no appeal. You couldn't explain that healing isn't linear. That joy sneaks up unexpectedly. That sorrow sometimes loosens its grip without permission. The rules didn't care. They weren't written for humans. They were written for order. As you pass through this section, you carry a sharper understanding of how mourning etiquette crushed lives, not with violence, but with precision. It didn't need prisons. It didn't need blades. It needed schedules, fabrics, and judgment. And it worked frighteningly well. You start to notice something almost uncanny now. The tears look the same. The bowed heads fall at the same angle. The sighs arrive on cue. Somewhere along the way, mourning has crossed an invisible line from ritual into rehearsal. This is where grief becomes suspiciously well-timed, and sorrow itself starts to feel staged. Royal courts were no strangers to performance, but mourning demanded a particularly convincing act. Too little grief raised alarms, too much invited ridicule or fear. So people learned to calibrate. They cried just enough. They withdrew just enough. They emerged just enough. Emotion became a dial adjusted carefully depending on who was watching. A mainstream historical fact anchors this uncomfortable truth. Court memoirs and diplomatic letters from the early modern period frequently comment on the correctness of mourning displays, praising or criticizing how convincingly individuals performed grief. These weren't private observations, they shaped reputations. You begin to realize that sincerity was almost beside the point. What mattered was plausibility. Did your grief align with expectations? Did it match your rank, gender, and relationship to the deceased? If yes, you passed. If not, suspicion crept in. Here's a quirky tidbit that feels almost darkly comedic. Some courtiers were known to feign illness during mourning periods to justify prolonged seclusion, allowing them to appear deeply affected without risking visible mistakes. Historians still argue whether this was common strategy or isolated cowardice, but honestly, it's a relatable hack in a deeply unrelatable situation. And then there were the tears themselves. Public weeping was sometimes expected, especially from women. But genuine tears are unpredictable, so people learn techniques, thinking of sad imagery, rubbing eyes, holding breath, to summon them on demand. Grief became a skill. Joke number 1 slips in quietly. Congratulations, you've unlocked the medieval equivalent of method acting, except the audience is armed with gossip. You notice how fake grief could be just as dangerous as real grief. If someone overperformed, it invited whispers of manipulation. Was the mourner seeking sympathy, positioning themselves as heir, fishing for alliances? Mourning became a stage where everyone assumed ulterior motives. A historical example sharpens this tension. After the death of certain Renaissance princes, rival relatives were accused of exaggerated mourning meant to claim moral authority. Their public sorrow was interpreted as ambition in disguise. Tears, it seemed, could be treasonous. Historians still argue whether contemporaries truly believed in the sincerity of these displays or simply accepted performance as part of court life. Either way, authenticity lost its value. What mattered was whether the act served stability, and stability required consensus. When everyone mourned in the same way, it suggested unity. When someone deviated, too composed, too broken, it disrupted the illusion. Mourning policed individuality more effectively than any decree. You feel how emotionally corrosive this must have been. When even grief is suspect, trust erodes. You stop believing in other people's sadness. You stop believing in your own. Emotion becomes something you use, not something you have. There's a fringe anecdote, debated but persistent, that some rulers privately mocked exaggerated mourners, even as they publicly praised them. Historians still argue whether this reflects widespread cynicism or selective cruelty, but it reveals the rot beneath the ritual. Everyone knew it was a performance. No one admitted it. As you drift onward, you realize something chilling. Staged grief wasn't a corruption of the system. It was the system working exactly as designed. When emotion is regulated, performance is inevitable, and the most dangerous tears were the ones no one could tell were real. You start to feel the imbalance now, the way the rules bend quietly depending on who's wearing the crown. Up close, it's almost embarrassing how obvious it is. Mourning, for all its rigidity, has loopholes, and kings slip through them with ease. This is where you watch grief become optional, selectively enforced, and unmistakably gendered. Men who ruled were expected to acknowledge death, not disappear into it. A black cloak, a solemn proclamation, a respectful pause in festivities. And then, gradually, business resumed. Councils reconvened, hunts restarted, foreign envoys were received. The machinery of power hummed back to life, often within weeks. No one accused the king of disrespect. They praised his strength. A mainstream historical fact anchors this pattern. Across early modern Europe, kings frequently ended official mourning far earlier than queens of comparable rank, especially when state business or remarriage negotiations were involved. Male grief was framed as duty-bound restraint. Female grief was framed as moral obligation. You notice how this double standard was rarely challenged. A widowed king remarrying quickly was pragmatic. A widowed queen remarrying at all was suspicious. Grief, it turns out, was less about love and more about containment, specifically containing women. There's a revealing tidbit buried in court commentary. Male rulers were often described as bearing their sorrow privately, a phrase that conveniently excused their visible absence from mourning rituals. Privacy for them was dignified. For women, it was antisocial. Historians still argue whether this reflected genuine beliefs about emotional difference or simply reinforced patriarchal convenience, but the outcome was predictable. Joke number 1 drifts in dryly. Apparently, emotional minimalism was considered a masculine virtue long before it became a podcast genre. You start to see how kings could weaponize this flexibility. Ending mourning early signaled readiness to rule, to negotiate, to marry, to move on. It reassured allies and unsettled rivals. Meanwhile, queens were expected to remain visibly anchored to the past, ensuring they posed no future complications. A historical example sharpens the contrast. After the death of several European queens, their husbands resumed public life swiftly, while court chroniclers praised their resolve. When queens outlived kings, however, their continued presence, even in mourning, was treated as awkward, sometimes threatening. They lingered too long for comfort. Historians still argue whether this imbalance stemmed from religious doctrine or political pragmatism, but it's difficult to ignore how consistently it favored male authority. Grief became another axis where power disguised itself as propriety. You also notice how male courtiers followed suit. Men were rarely penalized for easing out of mourning early, especially if they framed it as service. The realm needs me became a universal absolution. Women made the same claim and were accused of heartlessness. There's a fringe anecdote, often debated, that some kings deliberately reduced mourning expectations to prevent powerful widows from gaining sympathy and influence. Historians still argue whether this was conscious strategy or cultural inertia, but again, the pattern aligns too neatly. As you pass through this section, the hypocrisy feels almost mundane in its consistency. Mourning rules weren't broken randomly, they broke upward. The closer you were to absolute power, the more flexible grief became. And that tells you everything you need to know. In royal courts, mourning wasn't about honoring the dead, it was about protecting the living, especially the ones already on top. You feel the temperature drop here, not because the rooms are darker, but because the silence is sharper. This is the part of the palace where grief simply stops. Not because people don't feel it, but because they are not allowed to show it. Some deaths, you learn, are too awkward, too dangerous, too politically inconvenient to mourn at all. Royal courts loved order, but they feared certain kinds of endings. Executions, assassinations, suspicious Accidents, sudden illnesses that arrived right on schedule, these deaths disrupted the story the crown wanted to tell. And when a death disrupted the narrative, mourning became a liability. A mainstream historical fact anchors this chill. Individuals executed for treason or political crimes were often denied official mourning rights, even if they were members of the royal family. Their deaths were meant to erase, not commemorate. Funerals were rushed, restricted, or entirely private. Public grief was framed as sympathy for guilt. You begin to understand how brutal this was emotionally. Imagine losing a sibling, a spouse, a child, and being told that acknowledging your grief would mark you as disloyal. Silence became survival. Love became incriminating. There's a particularly unsettling tidbit buried in court correspondence. Families of the disgraced were sometimes instructed to continue daily life as if nothing had happened, hosting meals, attending church, smiling politely. Mourning would draw attention. Attention would invite questions. Questions were dangerous. Historians still argue whether this suppression of grief was primarily about preventing martyrdom or about controlling public memory, but the effect was devastating either way. If no one mourned you, history treated you as if you never mattered. Joke number 1 drifts in darkly because you need the heir. Apparently, nothing kills a legacy faster than being declared emotionally inconvenient. You notice how this extended beyond executions. Assassinated royals were sometimes mourned cautiously, with language carefully scrubbed of blame. Excessive grief could imply accusation. Too little grief could imply relief. Courts walked a tightrope, balancing sorrow against plausible deniability. A historical example sharpens the tension. After politically sensitive deaths in Renaissance Italy, official mourning was often shortened or muted to avoid inflaming factional conflict. Grief, once again, bowed to stability. And then there were the deaths that couldn't be explained at all. Sudden fevers, falls down staircases, hunting accidents that felt a little too neat. Mourning in these cases was tightly controlled, scripted to prevent speculation. You were allowed to be sad, but only in approved ways. There's a fringe anecdote, debated but persistent, that some courts discouraged mothers from publicly mourning children who died under suspicious circumstances, fearing emotional displays would invite gossip. Historians still argue whether this was policy or pressure, but the cruelty speaks for itself. You start to feel how mourning also shaped memory. Who gets monuments? Who gets anniversaries? Who gets silence? The absence of ritual erased people more efficiently than any decree. No bells, no black banners, no shared pause. As you move through this space, the lesson settles heavily. Grief is dangerous when it contradicts power. The dead who threaten narratives are buried twice, once in the ground and once in silence. And the living learn very quickly which losses they are allowed to feel. You step into spaces that smell faintly of incense and cold stone, where grief doesn't just bow to power, it kneels to doctrine. Here, mourning is no longer merely social or political. It's sanctified, blessed, locked into scripture and sermon until questioning it feels like questioning God himself. Religion, you realize, didn't soften royal mourning, it tightened it. Church and crown worked in close rhythm. Death was framed not just as loss, but as divine instruction. How you mourned reflected how obedient you were, not only to the monarch, but to heaven. Grief became a test of faith, and faith became a leash. A mainstream historical fact anchors this union. Throughout medieval and early modern Europe, royal mourning practices were closely guided by religious authorities with prescribed prayers, fasting periods, masses, and restrictions on behavior. These weren't optional devotions, they were public demonstrations of orthodoxy. You notice how theology hardened expectations. Suffering was framed as virtuous, endurance as holy. To mourn too briefly suggested spiritual shallowness. To recover too quickly implied sinful attachment to earthly joy. Grief, when properly prolonged, was proof of righteousness. There's a chilling tidbit hidden in devotional texts. Some sermons explicitly warned that insufficient mourning for a ruler risked divine punishment for the realm. Famine, plague, defeat, any of it could be blamed on collective emotional failure. Historians still argue whether people truly believed this, or merely feared the accusation, but fear alone was enough to enforce compliance. You begin to feel how religion closed the exits. Mourning couldn't be challenged as impractical or cruel because it was framed as sacred duty. To object was not just rude, it was heretical. Grief rituals became immune to reform. Joke number 1 slips in gently because you need it. Nothing extends a dress code quite like eternal salvation being on the line. You see how this affected rulers themselves. Kings and queens were expected to model piety through visible suffering. A monarch who appeared insufficiently mournful risked accusations of moral rot. Religious framing made grief performative and compulsory. A historical example sharpens the point. In Catholic courts, widows were often encouraged or pressured to adopt semi-religious lives, increasing prayer and withdrawal. The line between mourning queen and living saint blurred. Piety replaced presence. Historians still argue whether this religious pressure empowered some women through moral authority or simply removed them from political relevance, but again, the pattern is clear. Holiness was safer than ambition. Religion also standardized grief across regions. Mourning calendars aligned with liturgical cycles. Bells rang at prescribed hours. Silence fell on feast days. Grief was synchronized with worship, making deviation immediately visible. There's a fringe anecdote, often debated, that some clergy privately acknowledged the emotional harm of prolonged mourning, but defended it publicly as spiritually necessary. Historians still argue whether this reflects genuine conflict or retrospective projection, but it reveals an uncomfortable truth. Even those enforcing the rules sometimes doubted them. You feel how suffocating this must have been. When sorrow is holy, relief feels sinful. Healing feels like betrayal. Joy feels dangerous. Religion didn't just regulate mourning, it moralized it. As you leave these chapels behind, one realization settles in quietly. Once grief is sanctified, it becomes nearly impossible to escape. And that made it the most powerful mourning tool of all. You begin to sense it before it's obvious. The way eyes linger a little too long, the way footsteps seem to echo just behind you. Mourning, by now, is no longer only about sorrow or symbolism. It has become a method of watching, a system that keeps everyone visible precisely when they are most vulnerable. Grief, in royal courts, doubles as surveillance. During official mourning periods, routines changed in ways that made deviation stand out. Public appearances were reduced, movements restricted, schedules simplified. That sounds gentle, almost merciful, until you realize what it really did. It made patterns legible. Anyone stepping out of line was instantly noticeable. A mainstream historical fact anchors this unease. Court records show that during extended mourning periods, access to monarchs was often limited and carefully logged, with audiences granted selectively. Mourning simplified the social map, making loyalty easier to track. Who attended services? Who wore the right colors? Who appeared too often or not enough? You feel how grief stripped away camouflage. Normally, court life was noisy with celebrations, hunts, feasts, and travel. Mourning flattened all of that. When everything else stopped, behavior stood out in high contrast. A laugh carried farther. A smile lasted too long. Silence became suspicious too. There's a quietly eerie tidbit hidden in correspondence. Some courts assigned officials specifically to observe compliance with mourning etiquette. noting attire, demeanor, and attendance. Historians still argue whether these roles were formalized positions or informal duties absorbed by existing staff, but the function was clear. Grief was monitored. Joke number 1 slips in softly. "Congratulations, you're sad, but are you sad correctly?" You start to realize why mourning periods were so useful to those in power. People grieving are distracted, emotionally raw, less inclined to challenge authority. And when rules are strict, obedience becomes muscle memory. Surveillance doesn't need force when conformity polices itself. This monitoring wasn't only top-down. Courtiers watched one another relentlessly. Gossip became data. "Did you notice she wore grey today?" He smiled at dinner. These observations travelled quickly, often reaching those who mattered. Mourning turned social spaces into feedback loops. A historical example sharpens the picture. In several European courts, accusations of insufficient mourning were used to justify exclusion from favour or delay promotions. Grief became evidence, or lack of it became proof. Historians still argue whether this surveillance was intentionally designed or simply an emergent property of rigid ritual, but intent almost doesn't matter. The effect was chilling. Everyone knew they were being watched. Everyone adjusted accordingly. There's a fringe anecdote, debated but persistent, that some nobles deliberately exaggerated mourning in public spaces while privately resenting the dead, just to avoid scrutiny. Historians still argue how common this was, but the logic is painfully clear. When watched, you perform safety. You feel how this constant observation eroded trust. If grief can be reported, who can you confide in? If sadness is judged, who dares to express it honestly? Mourning isolated people emotionally, even as it surrounded them physically. As you move through this stage, it becomes clear royal mourning wasn't just about displaying loyalty. It was about measuring it. Grief provided the perfect excuse to watch everyone closely while pretending to honor the dead. And in that quiet, heavy stillness, loyalty was weighed, one black sleeve at a time. You can feel the tension sharpen now because by this point everyone knows the rules, and that's exactly why breaking them becomes catastrophic. This is where the smallest flash of color, the faintest hint of joy, can unravel an entire life. Not wars, not betrayals. Silk, ribbon. A dress that catches the light the wrong way. Mourning etiquette was unforgiving precisely because it was so visible. When grief is encoded in clothing, bodies become billboards. You don't need to speak to make a statement, you only need to be seen. And being seen incorrectly was dangerous. A mainstream historical fact grounds this fragility. In many European courts, the transition from full mourning to half mourning was rigidly regulated with specific dates allowing muted purples, greys, or white accents. Wearing these colours early or delaying black too long was read as intentional commentary, not accident. You picture the moment it happens. A woman steps into a public space wearing silk instead of wool. A ribbon reflects candlelight. Someone notices. Someone always notices. By evening, whispers have multiplied. By morning, reputations are bleeding out quietly. There's a notorious tidbit preserved in letters and memoirs. Several court scandals began not with affairs or conspiracies, but with accusations of improper brightness. Historians still argue whether these incidents were truly about colour or merely convenient excuses to attack rivals, but the result was the same. Careers collapsed over fabric. Joke number 1 drifts in because it almost feels unreal. Imagine being socially executed by a scarf. You start to see how mourning rules gave enemies a weapon. Accusations of insufficient grief were nearly impossible to disprove. How do you prove sadness? How do you measure sincerity? You couldn't. which made the charge devastatingly effective. Women were hit hardest again. Their clothing was read as emotional confession. A lighter shade suggested eagerness. A decorative stitch implied vanity. Even hair texture, too glossy, too arranged, could spark suspicion. Grief was supposed to erase attractiveness. Any failure to disappear was suspect. A historical example sharpens this cruelty. In several 19th century courts, women accused of breaking mourning etiquette found themselves excluded from social functions for years, regardless of intent. Apologies didn't help. Once grief was questioned, trust rarely returned. Historians still argue whether these punishments were about enforcing respect or about controlling female visibility, but the pattern is brutally consistent. Mourning was less about the dead than about disciplining the living. There's a fringe anecdote, often debated, that some women deliberately chose neutral mistakes, minor infractions, as quiet acts of resistance. A slightly lighter glove, a barely visible pattern. Historians still argue whether this was conscious rebellion or coincidence, but in a world this restrictive, even accident felt meaningful. You feel how fragile joy becomes here. Laughter is monitored, celebration postponed indefinitely. Even private happiness risks public ruin if it leaks. Mourning doesn't just silence grief, it silences everything else. As you move forward, you understand the real horror. When rules are this strict, people stop living in the present. They live in anticipation of judgment. Mourning becomes a trap that snaps shut not with noise, but with whispers. And sometimes all it takes is the wrong shade of silk. You feel it loosening now, not gently, but unevenly, like fabric tearing along old seams. The black cloth is still there, but it no longer commands the same fear. People begin to question it, quietly at first, then out loud. This is the moment when royal mourning, once absolute, starts to crack under the weight of modern life. Industrial clocks tick louder than church bells. Newspapers move faster than court proclamations. Death, once a rare and distant spectacle, becomes more visible, more frequent, more discussed. And suddenly the old rituals feel impractical, excessive, even theatrical. A mainstream historical fact anchors this turning point. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, many European monarchies formally reduced or simplified court mourning regulations, responding to social pressure, industrial schedules, and changing attitudes toward emotional expression. Mourning was no longer allowed to stop the world. You notice how public patience thinned. Endless black began to feel less reverent and more indulgent. When rulers remained withdrawn too long, critics accused them of neglect rather than devotion. Grief, once praised, started to look irresponsible. There's a quietly ironic tidbit buried in commentary from the period. Some newspapers mocked excessive royal mourning as outdated melodrama, comparing it to stage costume rather than sincere emotion. Historians still argue whether this criticism reflected genuine cultural change or simple media opportunism, but the shift in tone is unmistakable. Joke number one drifts in softly. Turns out, even grief has a shelf life once capitalism needs you back at work. You begin to see how mourning empires collapsed not because people stopped caring about death, but because they stopped believing in enforced sorrow. Industrial society demanded efficiency. Empires demanded visibility. A ruler who hid too long lost relevance. Women, again, were at the center of this fracture. Some widowed queens and princesses began re-entering public life sooner, cautiously, testing boundaries. The backlash was fierce, but shorter-lived than it once would have been. The rules no longer held forever. Historians still argue whether the decline of royal mourning traditions represented genuine emotional liberation or merely a shift in power optics, but either way, the authority of ritual weakened. mourning stopped being unquestionable. There's a fringe anecdote, debated but persistent, that some courts quietly abandoned strict mourning enforcement long before publicly admitting it, allowing elites to bend rules while maintaining appearances. Historians still argue how widespread this hypocrisy was, but it fits the pattern. Tradition didn't die, it hollowed out. You feel the momentum change. Mourning becomes symbolic again rather than totalizing. Black gives way to muted color. Silence gives way to carefully timed appearances. Grief remains, but it no longer freezes time. As you move toward the end of this long corridor, you realize something important. Royal mourning didn't vanish because it was cruel. It vanished because it stopped working. And when ritual loses its power to control behavior, it becomes history. You arrive at the quiet aftermath where the black cloth has been folded away, but its creases still linger in memory. Royal mourning no longer rules daily life, yet its logic hasn't disappeared. It's simply learned to wear modern clothing. You can feel it in state funerals, in carefully timed appearances, in the expectation that grief should look dignified, restrained, useful. The rituals faded, but the habits remained. Who gets publicly mourned? How long sorrow is considered acceptable? Which deaths become collective pauses and which are hurried past? These ideas didn't die with crowns and courts. They drifted outward into modern life, where they softened but never vanished. A mainstream historical fact anchors this continuity. Many contemporary state funeral protocols still trace their structure directly to royal mourning traditions, from dress codes to procession order to prescribed periods of public solemnity. The choreography survives even when the crowns do not. You notice how familiar it feels. Public figures stepping back out of respect. Criticism paused because now isn't the time. Grief used as a shield, a signal, a delay. The language has changed, but the mechanics haven't. Mourning still buys silence. There's a quietly unsettling tidbit. Modern etiquette debates around appropriate mourning, how soon someone should return to work, smile, date, or celebrate, echo the same anxieties that once haunted royal courts. Historians still argue whether this is cultural inheritance or simple human discomfort with grief, but the resemblance is hard to ignore. Joke number one slips in gently. Turns out we didn't abolish the rules, we just outsourced enforcement to comment sections. You reflect on what royal mourning really left behind, not black dresses or bells, but the idea that grief should be managed, observed, and judged. That sorrow must serve a purpose to be respectable. That emotion is safest when it's predictable, and yet something was lost when those empires of mourning collapsed. The shared pause, the permission to stop, the collective acknowledgement that death disrupts everything, not just schedules. Modern life rarely allows that stillness. Historians still argue whether royal mourning was more harmful than humane, more controlling than consoling, but perhaps the truth sits uncomfortably in between. It was both a cage and a language, a way to speak about loss when words failed at the cost of freedom. As the last echoes fade, you're left with a strange calm. The rules are gone, the judgment lingers, and grief finally belongs to no one but the person carrying it. You don't need permission to feel it, you never did. Now the pacing slows, the corridors widen, the lights dim further, the heavy fabric softens into shadow rather than weight. The stories settle instead of pressing forward. You breathe a little deeper, the tension easing from your shoulders, the history drifting into the background like a distant hum. Loss no longer demands performance here. It simply exists, acknowledged and then gently released. The palace grows quiet, not with fear, but with rest. Nothing is watching you now, nothing is counting. The night stretches comfortably ahead, unmeasured, unjudged, and still.